morning, everybody. It is past time to begin, which means I'm late for work, which means all of us are late for work. As you can tell from the screen behind me, we are starting a behemoth study on Kings, Samuel, and Chronicles. This is something that I geek out on. I love history. I just think it's fascinating, especially when you put all the events that we discuss in the Bible kind of in their historical context. And a lot of the stories I think that we'll read not just today, but also this quarter, you probably read before, but kind of seeing them in their historical context to me is very important. We're going to begin in 1 Chronicles. We won't jump around too much this morning. We will kind of look a lot at 1 Chronicles. But this is, I think, a very interesting, I think it's going to be a very enriching study. I can count, actually I couldn't count the number of eye rolls when I announced it a few weeks ago, but I think it's a study that's going to go really well. I want to just see real quick, a show of hands, how many people have studied Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, or how many of that before? Has anybody studied it? I know Zach has, you might raise your hand. Okay, so like 2 or 3 people, that's kind of what I anticipated. Most people don't study Chronicles because it seems like it's kind of, I don't want to say a wash, but there's a lot of overlapping material. A lot of us have studied Samuel, a lot of us have studied Kings. Chronicles is kind of that book that we put in the rearview mirror. I want to kind of look at that in depth throughout the course of this quarter, and so that's what I'm looking forward to doing. Before we begin, though, I'm going to turn it over to Joe for our first prayer.
Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for this another beautiful Lord today. Today to come together to study a portion of Thy Word, to sing songs of praise to Thy name later. We pray that You will be with us, that we will empty our minds of all of our worldly thoughts and concerns. Concentrate upon our purpose for being here. Be with Brady as he brings a lesson that he's prepared. May he teach it to us in a way that we can study it and make necessary application in our lives. Be with us throughout this class period that we can conduct ourselves in a manner well-pleasing unto You. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. Since it is such a big study, all 6 books, there's a lot to kind of go through. We're just doing some quick facts, a little bit of an overview of the book as a whole, or all 6 books. The first thing we need to realize is that 6 books used to be 3. There didn't used to be 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. They used to be 3 books. Does anyone know why it exploded to 6? I did not know this. The reason that I understand it to be is because when it went from the Hebrew to the Greek or Hebrew doesn't have vowels, Greek does. So the nature of the book kind of exploded. The quantity of the book kind of exploded and doubled in size. So you need more than one scroll to kind of put these books in one kind of unit. So you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, have 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles in order to accommodate all the quantity of material that's there. Chronicles, the name didn't really come about until about the 15th, 16th century. Martin Luther was the one that kind of coined that. So it used to be 3 books. They used to talk about 1st and 2nd Kingdoms before that, or in between that. But it used to just kind of be a very quick, kind of a very simple read. Obviously, it kind of exploded after the other ones. The authors are interesting too. You have Jeremiah that wrote the book of Kings traditionally. You have Samuel, Nathan, and Gad that wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel. Nobody really knows who wrote the book of Chronicles. Chronicles appears very much later in the historical narrative. Samuel and Kings are more books of history that appear earlier. And so nobody really knows who wrote the book of Chronicles, which makes sense because it's more of an exilic book. It happens towards the end of the historical narrative. So nobody really knows who wrote that book. So that's kind of something to keep in mind as well. It covers 400 years of history, both United and the Divided Kingdom. It begins with the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel, which we'll discuss a little bit more next week. It ends with the exile. 2nd Kings ends with part of the exile. 2nd Chronicles ends with what? Does anybody know? We'll discuss this a little bit more towards the end of the class. Does anyone know how 2nd Chronicles ends? 2nd Chronicles ends with them returning from the exile. So that's kind of, it's more of a hope-filled book. We'll discuss that here in a little bit. You have a ton of material in all 6 of these books. You have 167 chapters, 4,804 verses. So you have a lot of material, 400 years of history that we're covering this quarter, so it's going to be quite a bit. We're not going to do a verse-by-verse study in case anyone was worried about covering it kind of piece by piece. You also have 11 of the 16 prophetical books occurring during Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. The ones that you don't have are obviously the exilic books. You don't have, for instance, Malachi happening. You don't have Zechariah happening. You don't have Daniel, Ezekiel. Those are exilic or post-exilic books. If you're going to be here during our Wednesday night study, you'll probably get a little bit of that because we're going to be discussing great chapters from the minor prophets. And so we'll kind of take a piece of those, look at them in their historical context as we move forward. You also have 2 other great prophets that occurred during Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Who are those? Does anyone know? Elijah and Elisha, exactly. These guys didn't write anything, at least it's recorded for us, but the other 11 books are recorded for us that we'll look at here in a little bit. The breakdown is kind of hard to get. When you look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I should find some acronym or some kind of way to abbreviate that. The hardest part, at least for me to conceptualize, is the overlap of them. And that's kind of what we'll need to approach here before we go any further, because understanding the chronology and understanding how they overlap is pivotal to understanding these 6 books as a whole. But you have 1st and 2nd Samuel that kind of cover a lot of different things. What does 1st and 2nd Samuel cover? Just kind of in a nutshell. Right at the end of the Judges, the beginning of the kingdom, you can argue that Samuel is the last judge. I can't remember if that's place somewhere, but you have Samuel there, obviously. He dies towards the end of the book of 1 Samuel. What happens in 2 Samuel? As Nathan kind of mentioned.
That Saul is recorded, and you see kind of the rise of David as a king, not just as a hero.
Exactly. You have the death of Saul happening in the 1st chapter of 2 Samuel. The next several chapters are as David's rise as a king. This is where he's a valiant warrior. This is where he's just basically dominating everything. And then you kind of see this little slow fall of David, a little back up, then a little back down. So David is one of the more volatile kings that we'll discuss throughout the course of this quarter. We're going to discuss him in one class. And I think a lot of that is because we've touched on him in a whole bunch of other areas. But 1st and 2nd Samuel is really about the beginning of the monarchy. You still have the United Kingdom and all this. Where does the story go when you get to 1st and 2nd Kings? Ignore 1C for just 18 seconds. It kind of starts with Solomon. It doesn't start exactly with Solomon. What happens at the beginning of 1 Kings? You have the death of David. You kind of have the seize for power that Solomon is trying to grasp from one of his brothers. You also have Solomon carrying out David's last wishes with Joab, with a couple other people. But then 1st and 2nd Kings is just basically one king right after the other. And one of the more interesting things about these books is how fast-paced it is. You don't have a lot of attention paid to a lot of these individual kings. Some of them do amazing things, some of them do very horrible things, but it's very fast-paced. This guy kills this guy, then becomes king. This guy kills this guy, then becomes king. And I don't want to say political, because that's not the right word for it, but it's very quick. And so that's where we'll probably spend the bulk of our attention this quarter. The important thing to keep in mind is that 1st Chronicles covers the material in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We'll discuss this a little bit more here in a second. But 1st Chronicles covers 1st and 2nd Samuel. 2nd Chronicles covers 1st and 2nd Kings. And so if it's easier for you to kind of see that kind of visual format, that's at least the way it helps me. The content is a little bit different. We'll discuss that here in a second. But the characters largely remain the same. Samuel, Saul, and David are there in 1st and 2nd Samuel. You have Solomon kind of having a little bit of overlap. Then you have the prophets, and then you have the exiles in 1st and 2nd Kings. So the characters are the same, but there's a little bit of a difference in material. What is the difference between these books? Why do you have Chronicles when you have a story in 1st and 2nd Kings or 1st and 2nd Samuel? Why does Chronicles exist? It does give us the lineage of certain people, although you could argue that you could do that from 1st and 2nd Kings, so maybe that's unfair. Yeah. Why does 1st and 2nd Chronicles exist?
Is it more of a religious or spiritual narrative that goes parallel to more of a historical narrative?
Exactly. It's more of a religious narrative instead of a physical narrative. When you look at 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, it is very chronological. These things happen. It's a very historical book. These things happen, and these things happen, and these things happen. Chronicles isn't written that way. And that's one of the interesting things about Chronicles, and probably the reason we overlook it, is because it takes a much more religious kind of overarching spiritual narrative than 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings does. I'm just going to kind of abbreviate it that way. What is Chronicles about? Well, let me ask this question. If you're a person that's returning from the exile in 430 or 530 BC, what is it that you're looking forward to into the future? Because that's the scope of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What is it that you're needing if you're an exile returning? Hope. Okay, sorry, it was a little parrot voice over there. I didn't hear it. Yeah, you're hoping for rest, although you can argue that you had that a little bit in exile, but you are looking for rest, yeah. What specifically about hope, though?
The temple?
Right, you're establishing the what? Right, the reestablishment of Israel. I think I have Linda over there.
The temple?
The temple, exactly. And when you look at the two major dominant themes of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that's pretty much it. You have obviously the Davidic dynasty. That's kind of this big overarching narrative. We'll discuss David a little more here in a second. But you also have the reestablishment of the temple. These are the two things that you're looking forward to. Why is it that you're looking forward to those two? The Davidic dynasty and the temple.
In their history, that's when they were at their peak.
Right, in your history, that's when you're at your peak, yeah. Why is it that you're looking forward to those things? I think it goes a little bit with what Eddie mentioned with hope.
Because both of those are connected to the Messiah.
Exactly. Both of those are connected to the Messiah. If you're an exiled Jew returning, there's not a lot for you to look forward to. Obviously, your nation is in shambles, Jerusalem's destroyed, but you're looking forward to the Messiah that you know is coming. And you know that the Messiah is coming through what line? Right, the Davidic dynasty. That was a really hard thing to say. Then you have the temple thrown in there because of the religious overtones. You're looking for this kind of kingdom that exists. And so that's what you're looking forward to. When you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1, though, what does it begin with? Look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1. Right, a genealogy. 9 chapters of genealogy, which is obviously everybody's favorite subject. But what does he begin the genealogy with in 1 Chronicles 1? Adam. Why does he begin with Adam? Right, that's where everything begins. That's where creation began. Why else would you take it back to Adam? What are you trying to establish? A lineage, exactly. Which is important when you're in exile because why? There's a lot of questions about where you came from, what your lineage actually was. The destruction of Jerusalem in 606 was pretty catastrophic. So there's a lot of questions about where I came from, establishing that lineage. But there's another important reason to establish lineage. Why else would you establish it? What do you need if you're involved in the temple? You need a Levite, exactly. That's kind of what you're looking for as well. So you need the genealogy to establish true Judaism, especially when you consider what's happening in Israel. What happened in Israel? Intermarriage, where people are removed from it, so they bring in a whole lot of other people. It's kind of the beginning of the Samaritans. What was that? Right, they're diluting the purity, but you're also trying to figure out who's a real Jew and who's not, who's kind of the quasi. And that's where the Samaritan Jew kind of antagonism obviously begins. But you're looking to establish a Levitical heritage, you're looking to establish a Judaistic heritage, and so obviously you begin with Adam. When you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1, though, look at chapter 1 starting in verse 1. He says, he doesn't have any kind of introduction. He says, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What do you notice that's interesting about these first 4 verses? Or do you notice anything interesting about these first 4 verses? Well, that's kind of implied within it, that these people kind of come from these people. Adam then gives Seth, then gives Enosh, so that's the genealogy. Yeah.
It's not a, this is the son of the.
Right.
In verse 4.
Right, exactly. It's not a strict literal genealogy to say this guy begot these people, then this guy begot these people, then this guy begot these people. It's not a forked kind of genealogy, exactly. Why do you think that is? Because of all Adam's sons, which we know from Genesis 1 through 5, that he had lots of sons and daughters, why does he pick out Seth?
It doesn't serve the purpose of the narrative at this point. And 2, your scroll's going to get really long if you're going to start with Adam.
That's
you
true.
start listing out who each one of these guys had as sons.
Yeah. You're going to need to build out a temple just for the scrolls to cover all the genealogies. Yeah. And maybe other books cover that, but that's, as you mentioned, that's not the focus of this book. Yeah. So he mentions Adam, then Seth, then Enosh, and then who does he focus on after that? It says Adam, Seth, Enosh, then all these other names, and then look in verse 4. Who does he focus in on that? Noah, exactly. And then Noah has what? Shem, Ham, and Japheth, exactly. Why does Noah bring up Shem, Ham, and Japheth? I'm sorry, why does the writer of Chronicles bring up Shem, Ham, and Japheth when he hasn't mentioned the other sons?
Everything kind of started over with them. They repopulated her.
Right. I think that's a fair statement. Everything kind of started with them, so any other genealogy besides the one through Seth and through Noah kind of is a moot point because all of them got wiped away. So the new world begins with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. How do people view the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Because these aren't just three sons that kind of go off into oblivion. How do people view them? Yes?
I'm getting different races.
Different races, exactly. This is obviously traditional based, but you have a lot of people that would say, if I'm remembering right, that Ham is the father of, or the ancestor of the people from Africa. I think Japheth is the one from Asia, Persia, kind of the eastern countries. And then Shem is the one that's more of the east or the western, kind of the European people. All those are traditional accounts. It should be noted too that the whole descendant from Ham has been used to kind of advocate for slavery because you have the African nations. But also, what did Ham do? And I think this is important to point out too. What did Ham do that Shem and Japheth did not? This is when you dig into Genesis 7 and 9. Right, he saw Noah naked, exactly. And we don't have the time to go into that because that possibly could spawn some really awkward type of conversations. But what does Noah do to Ham because of that? He curses him, exactly. And so Ham is kind of by his side. Japheth and Shem are obviously the ones that the genealogy focuses on, but especially with Shem, because out of Shem comes who? Abraham, exactly. Look at verse 24. Verse 24, it says, Shem, or Arpachshad, I practiced all these names this week, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reus, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abram, that is Abraham. The sons of Abraham, verse 28, are Isaac and Ishmael. Why does he focus on Abraham? By the way, who does he mention in verse 26 and 27 that stands out to you? Or does anybody stand out to you? Isaac obviously stands out, yeah. I'm sorry? Ishmael he mentions in verse 28, yeah. Does anyone know who Peleg is in verse 25? I guess that's the question. A lot of these names that kind of jump in and out. Does anyone know who Peleg is? What's attributed to him? It says in Peleg, I'm sorry?
I think, isn't that where the world was divided?
Right, exactly. It says in the days of Peleg, I think it says it in Genesis, and I think it says it in 1 Chronicles as well, that in his days the earth was divided. Now that could obviously mean the destruction of the world through Noah, how the world kind of ripped apart physically. Other people have kind of ascribed it to the Tower of Babel where the nations were divided. I think to me that's probably the more accurate understanding of it. But Peleg is thrown in there as well, so it's kind of worth it to look at these. But he mentions Abraham and then he mentions who in verse 20? We already mentioned it. Who does he bring up in verse 28? Isaac and Ishmael, exactly. We know who Isaac is. Who is Ishmael? He's not the father of the slaves, no. Who is Ishmael? I'm sorry, what? Yes, he's the son of Hagar, exactly. What else is he known for? I'm sorry? More or less the father of Islam. That's what traditionally is ascribed to him, but I think the Bible specifically talks about he's kind of the father of the people that fight on Horus, these kind of Arabian. But what he does mention is, or what God says about Ishmael is, I'm going to make of him a great nation. And so that's kind of, I think, specifically the context there. Why does he bring up Ishmael? Because he brings up Ishmael and then talks about him in verses 29 down to verse 33. Why does he bring up Ishmael? I don't think so. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think so. Because there was a lot of other Gentiles besides Ishmael. You can see that in the other, when Abraham goes to other nations and interacts with other people, Ishmael came after all that. So I'd be careful making that type of statement. I don't think that's... They were one of the thorns in their sides for hundreds of years. Yeah, I think you can make that argument. Why else does he bring up Ishmael? Well, he was the firstborn, right, but he's not the child of promise, but you're exactly right. Isaac was the child of promise, Ishmael was the firstborn. Let me say this, I think it's for the same reason that he brings up Esau. If you look at verses 34 down through the end of the chapter, literally the end of the chapter is all about the descendants of Esau. The reason he's bringing up all these different people, in my opinion, when he brings up Ishmael, the reason he brings up Esau, is he's filling out the groups of people that they would have been familiar with. The enemies of the Israelites, the people that inhabit the lands around them. It's all it's kind of replacing everybody where they are. When you're returning from the exile and you're recovering your history, the questions that you would have are, who are these people? Where did they come from? What was their genealogy? What's our relationship with them? And so the reason, in my opinion, that the Chronicles brings up all these different people people and spends 4 or 5 verses talking about Ishmael, spends 20 verses talking about the descendants of Esau, is because he's filling out the context of their return back to Israel. That's, in my opinion, why he establishes these types of people. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments real quick?
I think it also, not to beat around the bush, that there were these very distinct couplets of Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and Esau. And one was according to promise and one was not. Or
Right.
one would be that lineage and the other would not be. And that makes a significant portion of their history. On top of that, you're going to find that, led by the Holy Spirit, the apostolic writers are going to mention both of those couplets later, one in Romans 9 and the other one in the book of Galatians. So you have that reference as well, that this is something that is going to come back.
Right. Yeah, the relationship between Jacob and Esau is kind of an archetype for other stories or other kind of illustrations later. And you're exactly right, that recurring theme, which also, as you mentioned or kind of alluded to there, that contrast between good and evil. And I think you see that even in the Samuel Kings and Chronicles narrative, where you have God's people, the people of promise, and then you have everybody else. And it's kind of this constant tension that exists between them. And so I think bringing them up not only to fill out the physical landscape, but also the religious landscape, I think is important as well. Somebody else have any thoughts or comments? It's worth pointing out, too, there's a couple other names on this list that are important. Keturah is mentioned right after Abraham is mentioned. Keturah is Abraham's second wife after Sarah passes away. He mentions Keturah in that lineage. You also have in verse 34, this is something that kind of goes by the wayside, or actually in verse 43. When he talks about the lineage of Esau, how does he describe them in verse 43? He says, these are the sons of Isaac and Jacob in verse 34 and 35. Verse 43, now these are the what? The kings. Exactly. And then when you look in verse 51, he says, now the what? Now the chiefs of Edom. And that goes back to Zach's point about establishing this kind of counterweight to Isaac, that there's always this kind of Gentile dominant force in the area that poses a constant threat to Isaac or to the lineage of Isaac. And that's that contrast between Esau and Jacob that I think you see within it. Somebody have any thoughts or comments on this? Okay, on to chapter 2. We only got 8 more chapters of chronology to go. We're actually going to shift very quickly through these next sections. This is obviously a very intense section, but what I want us to look at, especially as we look through these chapters, and we're going to blitz through chapters 2 through 8 a little bit quicker, but what I want us to look at in this is the inner workings of this. This isn't just a genealogy for genealogy's sake. This is establishing a religious foundation. This is establishing a physical foundation. And it's really kind of revisiting the landscape after the exile. If your entire nation has been annihilated, you have to have some kind of foundation to build on. That's where Chronicles really, in my opinion, excels. When you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 2, he mentions now, starting on the 12 sons of Jacob. That's basically what chapters 2 through 8 are about, these tribes and their descendants. But he says in verse 2, these are the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The sons, verse 3, of Judah were Onan, and Shelah. These 3 were born to him by Bathsheba the Canaanitess. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so he put him to death. Kind of a little bit of a commentary on that. But what's the difference when you look at verses 1 and 2 and that just rundown of the birth order of the tribes of Israel? What's the difference between that and verse 3? Look closely. Well, the sons of Israel mentioned Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar. I can't go past that. Are you talking when you say daughter? A daughter of Tamar is in verse 4. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. Yeah. What's the difference between 1 and 2 and 3? You expect as you read verses 1 and 2 what? Moving forward.
You're going to hear about all the sons of Israel in their detail.
Right, 7 chapters of this person and this person and this person. You expect that, Nathan. Right, you think it's going to be kind of this just kind of consecutive narrative. But when he lists the sons of Jacob in verses 1 and 2, or sons of Israel in verses 1 and 2, and then he begins in verse 3, who does he begin with? He does not begin with the oldest. That's the thing that's worth pointing out. Who is the oldest according to verse 1? Reuben, then who?
And Simeon.
Then Simeon, then who? Then Levi, exactly. Why does he begin with Judah in verse 3? That's where the Messianic line comes from. It has as much to do about Judah as it has to do with Simeon, Levi, and Reuben as well. Why are Reuben, Simeon, and Levi not mentioned first? Obviously, the focus is on Judah, the line of David, and that's what he establishes in chapters 2 through 4.
Well, most of these people coming back from exile anyway they were from the kingdom of Judah. So he's basically telling them, hey, here are your roots. You know, because I can tell you about the roots of all the people that are scattered all over the rest of the remains of the Assyrian Empire, but that's not going to do the Jews, as in the Judites, any good.
Right.
Whenever they're the ones who are, okay, well, where did we come from?
Yeah. That's true. I mean, if you start talking about the descendants of Reuben, you're like, well, that's great. I'm from Benjamin, so that really doesn't factor into my life. And as you mentioned, you're going to need a billion more scrolls to kind of get on that. He does discuss Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, but that's important to point out, especially Levi when you get to chapter 6. He discusses him at length. Why does he not begin with Reuben, Simeon, and Levi? What's their history specifically, those men? Let me ask you this. What did Reuben do?
Slept with his father's wife.
Right, he slept with his father's wife. You can see that. We won't read that necessarily, but that's in Genesis chapter 35, verse 22. Committed adultery with his father's concubine. Israel then relegates him away from the firstborn status. What about Simeon and Levi? And this is the story, by the way, with Simeon and Levi that I've always wanted to preach on, except I never really can find a way to shoehorn it in. But what does Simeon and Levi do?
Massacred an entire city of males for the rape of their sister.
Right, they massacre an entire city of males because those people, well...
There was one individual.
Right, there was one individual who raped his sister Dinah, or the sister of these 12 people. Yeah, how did they kill an entire city of people? That's the interesting thing. Circumcision, exactly. They said that these people, or the guy who raped Dinah, Simeon and Levi said, if you circumcise the entire city, then we'll give Dinah over to you, and she can be his wife. And it literally says, I think it's in Genesis chapter 34, 33, somewhere around there, it says, while they were still in their pain, Simeon and Levi then came and annihilated all of them. When you fast forward 20 chapters in Simeon and Levi's future, Joseph is now on his deathbed, or I think Isaac is on his deathbed, and he says something about Reuben and Levi. Does anybody remember? Obviously, Reuben and Levi are not great individuals, but what does he say about them? He says, you're not going to get a land inheritance. What are you going to do?
Ultimately going to be absorbed by your brethren.
Right, you're ultimately going to be absorbed by your brethren, but I'm going to what? You're not going to have your own little geographic boundary. You're going to have what inside of those? You're going to have cities. I'm going to scatter you. That's more or less what Isaac says to his sons Reuben or Simeon and Levi. He says, I'm going to scatter you. Now, Simeon by far would become the least, I don't want to say important, but he's by far the least kind of known tribe. He very quickly assimilates, and certainly by the time of the exile is over, he is almost completely assimilated in the other tribes. But Levi doesn't. Levi ends up getting all these cities, but what happens to Levi? As bad as the person Levi was, what do his descendants end up being? The priests, exactly. Why is it that they become priests?
By the time of Moses, whenever they built that golden calf, Moses says, anyone still faithful to God, come to me. And it's the Levites who came to him.
Right, the big golden calf scene, everyone's bowing down to it. The tribe of Levi is the only one that doesn't bow down to it. Because of that, they end up becoming priests. And so you kind of have this interesting split. The people, Simeon and Levi, are not great people by themselves, but their descendants. Simeon kind of gets absorbed. Levi probably would have met the same fate had they not had that episode of the golden calf where they then become priests after that. Regardless, when you look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, you have Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. They're not the primary ones for a very good reason. It begins with Judah in verse 3, because why? Why is Judah the one that is established, that Chronicles focuses on? Right. Right. That's the one we want to focus on. Judah is the one we want to focus on because out of him comes the Messiah. So we need to establish that dynasty, and also because not the fact that the Messiah comes from them, but who else was their ancestor? Who also came from the tribe of Judah several years before? Who is the Messiah made in the image of, or in the likeness of, for lack of a better phrase? I'm sorry? No, that's John the Baptist. That would be the herald.
I don't know, David.
He's a king in the manner of David, exactly. So you've got David up there kind of establishing what a king should look like. Then you have the Messiah coming out of that. And so you're not only looking backwards to establish what a model king is, but you're also looking forward to see maybe more or less what they will be. So the tribe of Judah is very important for these people. They want to fixate on them. They want to focus on that because that's the thing by which their future will be determined. You have Simeon, as I mentioned there at the end of chapter 4, thrown in there. He's not really super important. I think a few verses are relegated to him. They've been mostly gone. One important thing to bring out is 1 Chronicles chapter 3. 1 Chronicles chapter 3. We'll kind of hit some high points throughout these 8 chapters as we move through them. 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 17. This is the only verse we'll read in this chapter. He says, the sons of Jeconiah the prisoner, that's an important designation by the way, were Shealtiel his son, and then you have Malchram, Pedaiah, Shenazar. Who is Jeconiah? This is important to understanding the lineage of Jesus, or the lineage, or the kingship of Jesus.
He was cursed.
He was cursed. I guess it's called a blood curse, but you're right, he's cursed. What does Jeremiah say about Jeconiah? Does anybody know? What does Jeremiah say about Jeconiah?
None of his sons will sit on the throne.
Exactly. Not one of his sons will sit on the throne of David in Israel. Which, when you think about that, what does that mean for Jesus? He cannot what? Since he is a descendant of Jeconiah.
Cannot be an earthly king.
He cannot be an earthly king, exactly. So when you talk to premillennialists, or you talk to any millennials for that matter, who would try to argue that Jesus is going to sit on a literal throne of David in Israel, the blood curse of Jeconiah, which I think is mentioned in Jeremiah 32, 33 somewhere, literally says that that cannot happen. And people will try to go all different types of ways with it. And if you want to read some really entertaining reading, try to read Calvinist arguments and try and debunk the blood curse of Jeconiah to establish Jesus as an earthly king. Maybe that's something I would just giggle at. But it's hilarious to read kind of how they make it all up. So Jeconiah is there in chapter 3, verse 17. That's an important name to bring up. Chapter 4, verse 9, speaking of the religious world. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 9 brings up who? What lovely individual. Now Jabez, exactly. Verse 9 has one perspective of Jabez. Verse 10 has a different perspective. In verse 9, Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother named him Jabez, saying, because I bore him with pain. I'm pretty sure every mom in the world can probably identify with that. Want to call their kids Jabez at some point. Verse 10, now Jabez called on the God of Israel. This is the positive side of it. Saying, oh, that you would bless me indeed, enlarge my border, that your hand might be with me, that you would keep me from harm, that it may not pain me. And God granted him what he requested. The prayer of Jabez, several years ago, I think it was 10, 15 years ago, became this massive, popular, best-selling book. People did all sorts of sermons on it. Jabez is an honorable person, but when you read about Jabez, if you read that book, try to keep it in perspective of what he's talking about here. He's not talking about, promised blessings for us in today's world. Jabez was an honorable person, but we need to keep him within the historical context. I think he's somebody interesting to bring up. When you look at chapter 5, it keeps switching to these other tribes. You have Reuben, you have Gad, you have Manasseh. But Manasseh isn't a whole tribe. What's the deal with Manasseh? Manasseh isn't a whole tribe by itself. Or I guess it is, but not geographically. What happened to Manasseh? Exactly. They split. One half goes on the eastern side of the Jordan, the other one goes on the western side. And in verses 24, part of this half tribe of Manasseh is, you can see what happens to it. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 24, or verse 23. It says, now the sons of the half tribe of Manasseh lived in the land, from Bashan to Baal Hermon, Senir, Mount Hermon. They were numerous. These were the heads of their father's household, even Ephraim, Ishah, Eliel, Azriel, Jeremiah, Hodaviah, Jadiel, mighty men of valor, famous men, heads of their father's households. But they acted treacherously against the gods of the fathers, and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Syria, even the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He carried them away into exile, namely the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, brought them to Hala, Habor, Hara, and the river goes on to this day. Having a half-tribe of Manasseh established on the east side wasn't a bad idea in the first place, and it created some tension among the tribes. But what eventually did this distance create for them? Separation from Jerusalem. What did it create for the half-tribe of Manasseh? Distance from Jerusalem and distance from what? Distance from God, exactly. And I think that's one of the lessons you can take out of that. Yeah. When you look at chapter 6, then you have an entire chapter dedicated to Levi. You have an entire chapter dedicated to Levi. You're establishing not just any priesthood, but you're establishing the right priesthood, exactly. When you look at chapter 6, it's not just about the priesthood. Now, what else does he discuss in chapter 6? The priests are there. What else do you have? Because chapter 6, I thought about just reading all 81 verses in its entirety, but I'll obviously take the entire class. I never thought about that, in case you were wondering. But what is chapter 6? What else does he discuss besides the priests?
Their habitat.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Verse 31, they people for service.
Right, appointed people for service, the temple attendants. What did you say, Linda?
Their habitation, where they
Right.
will be.
The settlement of their cities in Israel, exactly. So now when they return back to Israel, where are these people going to be? Where is their establishment? Where are the priests going to be able to minister to God? And I think that's what he shows there, starting in verse 54 on down. There's a couple of people that are worth mentioning. You have in chapter 6 and verse 33 a man by the name of Haman, which wrote one of the Psalms. He's obviously a very influential musical figure. You also have in verse 39 his brother Asaph. Does anybody remember the word Asaph, the name of Asaph? Wrote 12 Psalms, exactly. So he's not just establishing priestly lineage, although that's important. He's also establishing the worship of the temple. So all of this kind of comes into view in chapter 6 when you mention the name Levi. It's not just about sacrifices and establishing one lineage. It's about the entirety of the temple worship as a whole. You get to chapter 7, you have Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, Manasseh, the other half tribe of Manasseh. You have Ephraim, you have Asher. And chapter 7, obviously, Benjamin is important. But when you look at verse 8, it's a specific focus on Benjamin. Why do you have a specific focus on Benjamin in chapter 8? What's the importance of Benjamin? Besides delivering to us the greatest left-handed judge in the world, Ehud. It's my favorite story, I can't help but say it. Yes?
Oh, Benjamin stuck with Judah when the kingdom split.
That's a big part of it. I think that's exactly right. I think that's the main focus of it. You have Benjamin being with Judah, and there's some issues later when it starts talking about one tribe or two tribes. The point is that Benjamin is more or less so small that he kind of is a part of Judah as a whole. But he is the other half of the nation of Judah. It's not just the tribe of Judah. Benjamin is there as well. Why else is it important to establish Benjamin? Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, exactly. And when you get to the end of chapter 9, who do you think we're going to start discussing?
Probably Saul.
Saul, exactly. Now Saul kind of comes at an interesting part because Saul doesn't really have much to do. And this is one of the interesting things about the book of Chronicles is it's very deliberate with its theme, where it picks up, who it highlights, what it talks about. And Saul doesn't get a whole lot of kind of airplay. When you look at the end of chapter 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 39, it mentions in verse 39, this is part of another genealogy, that Ner became the father of Kish, Kish became the father of Saul, Saul became the father of Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal. When you look at chapter 10, what's the very first thing that's mentioned after the genealogy about Saul? His death, exactly. Look in chapter 10, starting verse 1. After all the genealogies are over, now starting in chapter 10 and verse 1, the Philistines fought against Israel. The men of Israel fled before the Philistines, fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons. The Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle became heavy against Saul, and the archers overtook him, and he was wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and abuse me." His armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took his sword and fell on it. Why does 1 Chronicles 10, the story of the kings moving forward, why does it begin with the death of Saul? Why does it begin with the death of Saul? Right, it is going to focus on religious aspects, so you're going to start with David, right? Why else does it kind of end with or begin with the death of Saul?
Well, Saul went to the witch of Endor, and Samuel pronounced God's judgment on him. Said that he had pronounced judgment on him before about
Right.
But I mean, he said basically you're not going to be king.
Right. Saul kind of the end of 1 Samuel kind of fills in the historical gaps. You're gonna come before, he says, what's going to be my fate, or how can I make myself right again? The witch of Endor conjures up Samuel. Samuel then speaks to Saul and says, by this time tomorrow you're going to be dead. And so that's kind of a spooky way to hear about your death. But why does it begin with the death of Saul?
His death and his son's death paves the way for David to take the throne.
Right, his death and his son's death paves the way for David to take the throne. And I think kind of going with what Nathan talked about, he's the model. And so when you're looking back to the beginning, it's the same reason that 1 Chronicles 1 began with Adam. You're not looking to establish necessarily a straight genealogy as much as you are a theme, a story. You're trying to establish David as the leader or the model for kings moving forward. And it obviously ends with the death of, or begins with the death of Saul, because in the Chronicles mind, that's when the kingdom really should begin in the first place, at least moving forward in the future. And that's one of the things I think that's interesting about Chronicles, is it doesn't talk about every single thing that takes place. You don't have the Exodus mentioned anywhere. You don't have, for instance, you don't have the period of the wilderness wanderings mentioned really anywhere. They begin their life in Canaan moving forward. But David also, his high points are mentioned. You do have the census mentioned, but it's in very glowing terms. You don't have the story of David and Bathsheba mentioned in 1 Chronicles. Why? And it all goes back to this obsession with David.
Because again, that's not really, it's not that it's not true, it's just not the point of the writer at this junction of the exiles' lives. Like,
Right.
if you have kings that you're trying to model after, and you want them to be looking for someone in the likeness of David, throwing in adultery is not high on the list of things that you're going to be looking for. So he's trying to paint David in the, as you put the high points, the character aspects of David that you're going to be able to identify and decide.
Exactly. And Chronicles has a huge focus on this idea of the other kings not really living up to who David was. And so if you paint David, and it's not to say that Samuel or that he didn't do these types of things. Samuel is very open about David's failings. But as you mentioned, that's not the point of Chronicles. You want to establish David as an archetype of a king moving forward. And so you're going to gloss over his less stellar moments. You're going to highlight his really, really famous moments. And you're going to sugarcoat a lot of things that otherwise would be bad because you're trying to establish a positive tone moving forward. This isn't who we were. This is what we are now. That's what Chronicles is really getting at. When you look at the end of 2 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 23, you can't help but have hope moving forward. Because 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 23, we talked about this being the end of the exile. The exile is now over. But it ends on a high note. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. How does Chronicles phrase the decree of Cyrus? If you read that and you're a Jew, what do you think is your mission moving forward? Go back and build the temple, but also what? Don't just have a physical reconstruction.
But spiritual revival.
Exactly. Be his people. And so if you're reading the narrative of Chronicles as an exiled Jew that's since returned, your whole focus moving forward is, I'm going to establish true religion, true Judaism, which in my opinion is what paves the way for the Pharisees. When you get to the time of Jesus, these are people that are hyper zealous about it because they saw what happened to the kings and the Samuels during that time period. There's some quick themes, and we'll go through this pretty quickly. The story of these books is very simple. The nation is frustrated with God's leadership. You can see that right at the outset with the selection of Saul. They choose their own leadership, then they also abandon that true leadership, and then they are exiled to live under someone else's leadership. Which you can take these 4 points, by the way, and make them about just about anybody. We're frustrated with God's leadership. We want to choose our own. We see the punishment, and then we're exiled to live under someone else's leadership. It's kind of a story for all time, for lack of a better phrase. You also have some major themes. I'll put that back up in a second. You also have some major themes as well. The consequences of unfaithfulness, but especially pride. And this is something we'll discuss throughout the course of these books, is that you see all these kings kind of hitting a zenith, this kind of point of pride, and then the sharp downfall. David really doesn't. He kind of goes up and down. But Solomon is very explicit with them. Jeroboam is very explicit with this. They have this point where they're at the apex of their pride, and then they're brought low as a result of that. The contrast between God's will and the will of the people, there's this kind of constant tension. We want to do this. God wants us to do this. We're going to see how close we can get to that middle ground and still be more or less God's people. That's a major theme for all 6 of these books. This constant expectation of God's covenant promises, looking forward to David, looking forward to the kingdom, looking forward to the temple, So this expectation of when these things are going to happen, and also, as we've mentioned several times, Jesus as a king in the mold of David. Does anyone else have any thoughts or comments? The first class is always rough because I'm trying to establish a pace. The rest of this will not be nearly this intense, or at least it won't be this genealogy heavy. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll pick up next week. Thank you, everybody.